The meeting of the Planning Commission for Wednesday, November 13th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. is hereby called to order at 6:31 p.m. Iris, can you call roll, please?
Moreno,
Here.
Mitchell,
Here.
Najak,
Here.
Rigby,
Here.
Ganoni. Here. Fly.
Here.
Wing is absent.
Thank you. Do we have a city council update?
Councillor Mahboub has not checked in, so no.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have the approval of the minutes for the meeting of October 14th, 2024. Do we have any questions or amendments or a motion?
I move to approve the minutes of the meeting of October 14th, 2024 as drafted.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed?
I'd like to abstain.
Thank you. And do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
No.
Thank you, Iris. And I don't see any general updates for the Commission for Citizen Involvement. So we'll move on to the findings, conclusions, and order. We have 7.1, climate-friendly and equitable communities parking, LU 24-0025. Climate-friendly and equitable communities parking, On October 28, 2024, the Planning Commission issued a preliminary recommendation for the City Council to approve the proposed amendments with a modification to remove the option to pay into a renewable energy fund from the list of available climate mitigation actions required for surface parking lots larger than 1/2 acre, and directed staff to prepare the draft findings, conclusions, and order for further consideration. Do we have any questions, comments, revisions on this?
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, if I can just remind the Commission that there were 4 members present at the last meeting. That's directed for tentative findings. All persons are eligible to participate in this vote for adoption of any final findings. And the question is whether or not the findings represent the decision of the majority of the Commission tonight. Okay, so.
So from what I understand, the mover and the second are limited to the commissioners that previously voted to tentatively approve the proposal?
If they're going to move the findings as presented, and to speak to the elephant in the room, the question had to do with regarding a payment in lieu, and the commission was split 2-2, and I know 2 of the commissioners basically gave a friendly aye in order to move the whole package through. If that is not the majority wish of the commission tonight, then it would be somebody could move to adopt the findings, but without section 1. Okay. Of course, if the commissioners want to move it with as presented, certainly, actually anybody could make that motion.
Okay. Do we have a motion?
I have one small note. I know there's a section in the findings addressing, for anyone that wasn't here, we received some testimony that is discussed in the findings about from a resident who had concerns that these changes could result in a lot of traffic from parking on residential streets, and that could create problems with emergency vehicles and overall navigation. I think that's addressed on page 4. I think what's written there is certainly true with regard to these changes themselves would not create such a problem. But I think I think most of us could see that there could be a spill-on effect of, people trying to park in residential areas to avoid, their lack of parking that may result. Therefore, I think maybe a small change of saying, right now it says, accordingly, the commission finds that the proposed code amendments do not degrade traffic flow by obstructing the travel path of vehicles in the right-of-way, et cetera. I would maybe say the proposed code amendments do not directly degrade traffic flow. I think that would something like that would more accurately represent, my views on the matter.
Any other revisions? No, so then we need a motion to approve with the revisions as,
Well, the mover would have to decide whether they wish to present the findings as presented, as Commissioner Rigby has proposed a revision, or if the mover wants to make any other revisions, including regarding, as I indicated, Section 1,
thank you.
or Section 1.
I would move to adopt the findings with the change that I previously noted.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
Are we allowed to debate once the motion's been made?
Well, you certainly are, unless the chair is ready to move to a vote. So if you want to deliberate further on the motion, that's
Please deliberate.
I guess Commissioner Rigby, you want to put the word direct, it's page 4 of 5, I see, put the word directly in front of, does not directly degrade traffic flow?
That's exactly right.
Line
That's what I'm
34.
proposing. Yeah.
By implication, are you saying it indirectly degrades traffic flow? I guess I'm just trying to understand the significance of the word.
That's right. I think, we, in the course of looking at, these changes, we have, discussed a couple of times areas where, lack of, having an abundance of parking has created an environment that can at times be difficult to get through, like residential areas in, say, southeast Portland, where, larger vehicles can sometimes have trouble getting through double parked streets. Now, this, I think, adequately addresses the fact that, sometimes, that kind of situation is created by effectively illegal parking, in that there are other remedies that the city can take to ameliorate that. But I think in general, in practical fact, I would anticipate there being some problems that could occur from spillover parking. And to me, this as written does not quite adequately reflect that.
I agree with Commissioner Rigby. Typically, parking effects are on a site-by-site basis because every site is unique with its own shape and own layout. So I think it's too far of a reach to say definitively there are no parking and traffic implications from this. So having more open language that we don't foresee any, but there may be some indirect or unforeseen effect.
And so your suggested change really just is in the commentary, for lack of a better, but in the commentary of the findings, but not a change in any of the proposed actual code amendments in relation thereto.
I would characterize it that way.
I guess I personally don't have a problem leaving it open-ended, because I don't think it actually changes the substance of any of the things that I'm in favor of.
So with no further revisions, then the motion passes?
But go ahead and call for the vote. This is a formal adoption, so I think a roll call would be appropriate.
Thank you.
Mitchell,
Yes.
Moreno,
Yes.
Knobloch,
Yes.
Rigby,
No.
Canoni?
Yes.
Just, can I clarify, were we voting on, I was under the impression we were voting on it as you moved with your proposed revision.
Oh, I thought Chair Moreno said without the revision.
No, with the revision. I
Oh.
said without any further
Oh,
revisions.
excuse me. In that case, I would vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. I wondered about that too.
No worries.
Okay, so we would follow the agenda onto the work session, but we are going to ask Amanda Watson to present the electric vehicle charging strategy.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the accommodation. Good evening, Commissioners. My
Evening.
name is Amanda Watson. I'm the City Sustainability Program Manager. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Is this-
Yeah.
Excuse me, sorry, just getting the presentation set up here. Thank you. So I'm going to provide an update this evening on the city's electric vehicle charging strategy. This is a project that we've been working on over the past year in support of the city's transportation electrification goals. And I came before the Planning Commission, I want to say it was last year, so if not a little before. So it may have been, some of you may be new to this topic, so I'll give a little bit of an overview and just wanted to highlight a couple areas where this work touches on or sort of intersects with some of the issues that you have been working through in the Planning Commission, particularly the climate-friendly, equitable communities rules. So for some background, the city's 2020 Sustainability and Climate Action Plan identifies transportation electrification as a key strategy to reduce emissions from transportation in Lake Oswego. Transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our community, which is common across the United States and certainly in Oregon. And so transitioning to electric vehicles in the short to medium term complements as longer term strategies to transition to more sustainable forms of transportation, such as building out, biking and walking pathways, and electrifying and improving public transit access. So EVs are kind of a short to medium term key strategy for reducing transportation emissions in LO. And up on the slides here are 4 of our 5 EV-related goals in the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. The first goal that's not up here has to do with transitioning the city's fleet, adding more electric vehicles to the city's fleet as departments purchase more vehicles. These other 4 are really focused on the community and increasing adoption of electric vehicles by residents. And so we did a progress report on the 2020 Climate Action Plan in 2023, so looking at the first 3 years. And one of the kind of findings that came out of that progress report is that we need to do a little more work to look across these goals and to develop a strategy for EV charging infrastructure that can help us take us to the next level of how do we support residents to adopt more electric vehicles. So the goals of the electric vehicle charging strategy is to really promote equitable access to EV charging, which means we're focusing on where there are gaps in access to charging infrastructure right now and how the city can address them. So just again, some of the overview or the objectives of the EV charging project are to expand equitable access to EV charging infrastructure in Lake Oswego, to clarify the role of the city in this work and identify opportunities where the city could partner with other entities or where other entities might be better suited to lead this work. And then to position the city and partners to access local, state, and federal incentives and grant opportunities related to electric vehicle charging. Kind of where are we today in terms of electric vehicle adoption and charging infrastructure in Lake Oswego? The data on the slide is the most recent we had at the time from Q1 of this year, so I'm hoping we'll get new numbers soon, but Lake Oswego is actually leading the state in electric vehicle adoption. So in Oregon as a whole, around 2% of light-duty vehicles are electric vehicles, and in LO, almost 8% are, so it's great news. We have 45 public charging ports as of, again, Q1 of this year, so there are some more, and 8 DC fast charging ports across the community. 12 of those ports are city-owned, including at City Hall, at our maintenance center, on A Avenue, and then we just installed a new EV charging station at the ACC that's available for the public in the fall of this year. To inform the EV charging strategy, we did a study, or a survey rather, of community members in the fall of last year, both asking EV owners and non-EV owners to give us their feedback on their kind of motivations for owning an electric vehicle, how they charge their vehicle, or how they expect they would charge their vehicle. And one of the key findings that we found in that survey was that residents prefer to charge their electric vehicle at home. So folks who responded to our survey who already owned a vehicle, 87% of them said they prefer to charge at home. And people who do use public charging used it, one time a month on average for 1 or 2 hours. So really kind of short charging up when they were going places. This is also supported by national research that says, about 90% of folks who have an electric vehicle prefer to charge at home. And the reason is that tends to be the most convenient and low-cost option for charging. That said, access to EV charging infrastructure is a barrier to adoption. So folks who don't have access to charging at home, often that's a barrier for them to actually have an electric vehicle. Some of the other common barriers, as you might expect, are price or lack of familiarity with the technology, but charging infrastructure is a really key one. So when we looked at developing the EV charging strategy, as I mentioned, we started by identifying where in our community are there gaps in access to EV charging. So both looking geographically, so this map shows the blue dots are existing public chargers in the community, but also in terms of kind of demographically. So we know that folks who are less likely to have access to home charging, which again, the most convenient, lowest cost option, are folks living in multifamily buildings. In particular, lower income households may have barriers because if you live in a multifamily condo community, for example, you may be able to install a charging station, but that would cost additional money, so that could be a barrier. And then again, renters may have an additional barrier in accessing charging where they live. So this was one of our kind of key focus areas, is how can we look at expanding charging access for multifamily building residents, as well as our daytime population. So as you know, many folks who work in LO live elsewhere and vice versa. And so we wanted to be able to understand how can we support commuters who are part of our community, who drive vehicles in LO, to also have electric vehicles, as well as tourists and visitors. So these are the gaps we're looking at addressing in the electric vehicle charging strategy. In developing the strategy, we did a couple of things. So we reviewed electric vehicle readiness plans from other cities, particularly in our region, talked to internal and external stakeholders, and got feedback from City Council through 2 study sessions to develop essentially a list of draft action strategies that the city could take to expand access to charging infrastructure. I'm sorry, this is a little bit small, but I'll walk through it on the screen here. So the actions that we proposed to the City Council were categorized here in terms of the primary role of the city, right? So the city can have sort of an educational role in promoting access to electric vehicle charging. There are sort of enabling roles that the city can take, sort of ordinance-wise or others, and then the city could directly install the infrastructure, right, for public EV charging. The City Council's feedback was that the majority of these strategies they were supportive of. So certainly educating that the city could work both directly, through My Sustainability program, but also in coordination with community partners like the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network and others, to do outreach and education to residents, but particularly to multifamily building residents, property owners where possible, to educate folks about the benefits of having electric vehicle charging, different types of technology that could meet their needs, as well as some of those financial incentives, grants and rebates that are available. City Council was also supportive of enabling actions like identifying criteria to prioritize where we want to see charging in our community. That could both be kind of a signal for the private sector to put in charging stations, as well as help guide city investments. They were supportive of installing wayfinding signage for publicly accessible chargers, which we do have right now for City Hall. We don't have it yet, and actually at the Maintenance Center. We don't yet have signage for the ACC, so that could be a next step. Essentially, when folks are driving through town, they see those blue signs and know where they can go and charge. And City Council was very supportive of exploring options for, to encourage more private investment in charging infrastructure. Two of the actions that are in gray here, actually three of the actions in gray here, are more regulatory approaches. So would it direct private investment in EV charging or EV-ready infrastructure? So this is the connection to the climate-friendly, equitable communities rules. These were options that we discussed with staff and kind of put forward to City Council, but they asked for more research on the potential economic impact or impact on development of these strategies. So one of the strategies was that the city could consider adopting EV-ready codes that require new developments to provide for more parking spaces with this EV-ready charging infrastructure than the minimum required by state codes that's required by the climate-friendly, equitable communities rules, right? So these new rules that I know the Planning Commission just worked on, so guiding the city to adopt, say that in new multifamily buildings, 40% of spaces now have to be have the conduit to support level 2 charging. That legislation allows cities to raise that threshold if they so choose, and the city of Portland just did that. So that was one of the options we put forward for City Council to consider. The other one was a creative idea to say that, we understand that climate-friendly, equitable communities rules may also result in elimination of parking minimums, which we were just talking about, and that if that were to be the case, we could consider regulation that required developers that provide no parking for a housing project to provide EV-ready charging infrastructure for the right-of-way. And then finally, a lot of cities have right-of-way charging programs, local example is the city of Portland that kind of provides guidelines for private developers to install infrastructure for charging in the right-of-way. So City Council said these are interesting, but we want to understand what are the impacts on development. And so I looked particularly at the city of Portland as an example for the EV-ready code option because they just adopted an ordinance of their own that requires 100% of parking spaces for new multifamily developments that have 6 or fewer spots, so a small parking lot, 100% have to be EV ready, and then I think it's 50% for all other lots. So they kind of took the state requirement and bumped it up a little bit. For that project, they did, I'm forgetting the company they worked with, but they worked with a consultant to do an economic analysis. And it found that that additional EV-ready infrastructure requirement was only between 0.2 and 1.2% of the total project costs, and the impact on rent would be less than 1%. So they found the economic impact to development was insignificant at the time, or not very significant at the time. That said, ultimately, my recommendation to City Council that they kind of were understanding of and supported as well was that we wait before we kind of further explore these regulatory strategies because the Planning Commission and the city was working through implementing climate-friendly, equitable communities. So right now, we just adopted that new 40% threshold. We don't really yet have, I think, the data or the understanding to know how much we might want to raise it, if we want to raise it, or whether or not that's really the right solution. When I talked to the state about kind of how they set that 40% threshold, they explained it was a balance between sort of housing affordability and being able to facilitate more EV ownership, and that they had to also only adopt a kind of across the board requirement for level 2 charging technology. They weren't able to say, we want X% of level 1 charging, which is where you can just plug your vehicle into the wall, like a standard wall outlet, right? Or have fast charging. And so in a little bit of a way, it's a blunt instrument. And so I think we will have more information in the coming year at least about how additional changes to or how regulatory approaches to getting more EV charging might make sense. And again, same thing for housing projects that don't provide any parking. I think we could use a little more data on what do those projects look like? Is right-of-way charging appropriate for our community? And if so, how? So we took a little bit of let's take another look at these potential regulatory strategies in the future for those. Finally, on installing, the City Council was, I'd say, split, not in consensus in terms of using city funds to pay for public charging infrastructure. So their kind of agreement was that they'd like to see the city focus on installing publicly accessible charging infrastructure at city facilities rather than kind of in the right-of-way or in other public locations. So we're going to kind of right-size that and start there. Any questions on kind of the actions at this point? I can continue, but I want to pause if you need any clarification or have questions on that piece. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the equitable access side, is that specifically then referring to renters versus homeowners with not having as much access at multifamily sites?
A little bit, yeah. So equitable in terms of who currently has barriers to access charging. So yeah, in general, it tends to be easier for a homeowner to have charging at home, but if they are a low-income homeowner, maybe not. So I think we're looking at kind of different layers in general, trying to look at what are the gaps and barriers and how do we address them. So multifamily communities is kind of in general, it's harder to have charging there because of shared parking or things like that. Individual residents don't always have the ability to put in charging, so that's one. But it could also be single-family homeowners that are lower income or that are renters. So a little bit of a cross-section of those populations, if that makes sense.
Okay, I guess a follow-up question then would be how this improves either access to charging or access to even having an electric vehicle for low-income families. And low-income might mean something different in Lake Oswego than it does in other places.
Exactly. Good question. The idea is that encouraging, either working with private sector entities and community partners to encourage the installation of more public charging infrastructure, or the city installing charging at public facilities that are close to folks, areas where there are a higher percentage of renters or multifamily communities or lower income residents, that provides that access, right? It's not the top choice, which is at-home charging, but that the public charging can help address that gap in the meantime, right? So that's the idea. Charging access is only one of the barriers to EV ownership, but it is one that we have the ability to influence. And there are other programs like state and federal rebates that help address that kind of upfront cost barrier, which is often even a more significant challenge for folks to have electric vehicles. Yeah, that's a good question.
Good evening. Do you have any information on the percentage of low-income homes that have an e-vehicle?
I don't in Lake Oswego. The registration data I have is from the state, and so they're just able to give me the high-level number. I can ask, and see if they have demographic data attached to it, but I don't have that myself.
Okay,
Yeah, we just get the state DMV data, basically.
thank you.
Yeah. So one of the enable actions here was developing site criteria. So I wanted to just walk through a little bit of what we would be thinking about in terms of, what looks like a good site for public EV charging that actually meaningfully increases access for the folks that we want to be, the folks that need it most. So one of those, to your point, Commissioner, would be nearby multifamily housing, but in particular, affordable housing areas of the city that have a higher percentage of low and middle income residents and rental properties. Nearby points of interest, this would be things like public facilities, like commercial areas, like schools. Actually, when we were doing community engagement and the Sustainability Advisory Board's input was that public schools would be a really great place for folks to have public charging. So this is a conversation we're continuing to explore with the school district. Other good locations for public EV charging that actually can address the lack of access to at-home charging is making sure that parking is accessible and accessible overnight, right? So that folks can leave their vehicle for an extended amount of time and be able to charge. Also, ADA accessibility is an important consideration, as well as available electric capacity for a site. This is because electrical upgrades can be a significant cost barrier to getting charging stations installed. So we really want to kind of be prioritizing sites across the city that don't require those costly utility upgrades or extensive trenching and things like that as much as possible. So next steps for our project. We are going to be working on finalizing that sort of list of criteria. What makes a good site? How are we going to prioritize? In particular, looking at a plan for charging at city facilities. So right now, based on City Council's feedback, I'm working with the Parks Department to look at parks locations that might be good, right, that might meet some of those criteria and help fill in the gap for residents and visitors who don't have access to charging at home. We're going to be, again, identifying potential sites, putting together, sort of budget and timeline considerations. The Parks Department is working on a Parks Plan 2040, and so we're hoping we can kind of have these conversations at the same time. I'm continuing to work with our community partners, and we're kind of planning for community-led outreach to multifamily buildings. So some of that educational, efforts about helping property owners and residents understand the technology, understanding residents' needs for charging. Do folks want it? What is most useful for them, right? Is that a fast charger if possible? Is that slow level 1 charging, or is level 2 meaning, right? We kind of need to understand on a site-by-site basis what the needs are and how the city and other partners might be able to meet them. And then finally, the city of Lake Oswego was part of a cohort of 17 different cities led by the city of Tualatin that just received a $15 million federal grant for public charging, which is really exciting news. So the city of Tualatin is leading this work, but the grant is specifically to install publicly accessible EV charging in our region for low and middle income residents with a focus on affordable housing properties and public facilities. So it's nice because this aligns really well with the EV charging strategy and kind of where the city council wants to focus our efforts. There's a lot of details to come because the grant was just awarded, but in the next, hopefully, year or two, we will have more information about exactly how many sites we'll have in Lake Oswego, have a process to prioritize where they will go, kind of do community outreach, and get some charging infrastructure installed. So that is kind of an exciting newer development. And kind of back of the envelope estimate is we probably would have somewhere between 4 and 6 sites in Lake Oswego for charging funded through this grant. Overall, it's going to fund a minimum of 125 charging sites across the 17 cities. So it's nice too because we get to look regionally, right, at this infrastructure and how it addresses gaps. I think that's it for now. But yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm happy to be a resource for the Planning Commission going forward, as this charging strategy work intersects with the work that you all are doing.
Thank you very much for that update. Does anybody have any questions, comments?
I have a small question. In the existing chargers and in the chargers to come, what does the pricing structure look like for the energy?
That's a good question. Right now, they were set to be break even with the cost of electricity, and so I should remember, I think it's 9 cents a kilowatt hour to charge, and then there's a parking fee for folks who are parked at one of our city chargers for longer than 2 hours to encourage that turnover. I think as electricity prices have risen, that we're now a little below that, so I'm not sure that they have been adjusted in the past year, for example. But yeah, it was at least recently 9 cents a kilowatt hour for charging at city facilities.
So in the plan going forward for all of them would just to be at a market electric rate?
Yeah, essentially, we're not wanting to make money on the charging stations, but right now there's not support for them to be free. Just a difference in opinion of some folks on city council, but that can be something we can continue to revisit is the pricing structure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got a couple quick questions for you. Has there been any thought given to the bigger picture of where you place the charging stations with respect to main traffic corridors? So, for example, if I'm traveling from Seattle to San Francisco and I'm in an e-vehicle, I'm going to have to stop along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have to stop somewhere around Lake Oswego, it's not very convenient, I would believe, because now I'm going to have to go into the city and find one as opposed to being really close to a freeway exit point. So has there been any talk of almost collaboration by cities to almost states in terms of we're going to populate along major corridors to really allow longer-term driving capabilities for EVs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes and no. Yes, because we haven't had close coordination with the state on our local work, but yes, because the state is working with federal dollars, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funds, NEVI funds. The state is installing charging stations every 50 miles along what are called alternative fuel corridors, but it's essentially major highways in Oregon. So I-5, 205, 84. So federal dollars via the state are helping to address that kind of long distance travel need and kind of build out the EV highway system, which is great. So our strategy is more looking at how do we, understanding that work is happening, how do we complement it locally for, residents and local traffic?
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question is more on the actual energy grid itself. So as more of these stations get put in, what research or planning is being done to be able to support the power needs into the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that PGE, our electric utility, is looking at this very, very closely. So in their transportation electrification work, they right now aren't, their expectation understanding is that the grid can support electric vehicle charging, but they're also focused on kind of looking ahead, right? They're needing to procure more renewable energy resources for state targets, but they're also working on more distributed generation so that can help support, for example, more batteries, more solar and storage that can help support that resilience as we're electrifying the grid for things like transportation. So PGE is leading that work, but we work closely with them. They actually have a number of charging programs that we haven't been eligible for in the past, but we're continuing to kind of reach out to them and understand where we can work with them on installing charging infrastructure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last question I had for you is the average cost of an EV today is about $56,000, and you get a tax credit of $7,500. So if you're kind of watching the politics that's going on, that tax credit could potentially go away. So now we're talking about a $65,000, $70,000 car. And I'm a big EV fan. So my question is, it's just more tactical as you look at, well, okay, we want low-income families to have charging stations, but the vehicles are out of reach for a low-income family. So it's almost like we would like all this, but from my perspective, the math doesn't quite add up. So how do you address that? Because these costs are not going to go down. The car costs keep going up, and a lot of these companies are not profitable with EVs, so they have to raise the price to get into the luxury market to be profitable. So how do you see this all playing out long-term as you populate low-income homes with charging stations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think some of this will depend on kind of what happens nationally, and I think you're right that we'll likely see those tax credits go away federally. But we do still have state goals, right? So the state has a goal that by, I think it's 2035, 80% of new vehicles need to be battery electric or hybrid, and you see that in Washington, Oregon, and California. So I think these states are continuing to drive the market, and we are seeing some lower price vehicles kind of being planned for the future. But yeah, I think we're going to need that support from the state to continue funding their EV program, right? Their EV rebate program, which has been hugely popular. It's like usually fully committed in the first few months of the year when it's been funded to bridge that gap. And battery prices are coming down, so the hope is that EVs will continue to be more and more cost competitive. Right now, they are still expensive, and so we need to see those state rebates, continue to be funded. I think that's something the city can advocate for, and hopefully things will hold at the federal level, but we'll have to see what happens there. Yeah,
A lot of moving parts.
a lot of
in
moving
this whole
pieces.
topic,
Yep,
yeah.
and it's a holistic work, right? And so this is why our planning department, our engineering folks are working on pathways projects, right? Because it's not just electrifying single passenger vehicles or single person vehicles, but it's looking at the transportation system as a whole, right? And how can we support decarbonizing that and more sustainable modes of transport? EVs are important, but they're just one piece of the bigger puzzle. So
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah, thanks for the questions.
Good questions. Any more? Thank you, Amanda, for the
Thanks for
presentation.
having me.
So we move on to our work session. Item number 8.1, Community Development Code 2024-2025 Annual Amendments. Work session number 1, LU 24-0029. The commission will review a list of potential code amendments to the Community Development Code and provide initial input and feedback. Staff coordinator is Evan Franstead, senior planner.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Good evening. We barely can hear you.
There we go. Good evening. All right, so tonight we will be reviewing 27 possible code amendments to the Development Code. The goal of this work session is to provide you with a clear understanding of each amendment, to provide any concerns, to identify any concerns you may have, and to answer any questions. We'll be reviewing each item briefly and discussing its implications before moving on to the next one.
Is there another clicker that would work for that?
It should work because it worked in the last one, huh?
Yeah. Timing for the batteries to go out, I guess. It's doing something now.
There we go. Okay, so the items are grouped together into maintenance and policy items. The proposed maintenance items is to clarify existing standards for operational efficiency and consistency with other codes or address changes in state or federal law. Policy amendments are the substantive code amendments that require more research, public input, and discussions. So we'll start with the maintenance items, then move on to the policy items. The items are listed in order based on code citation, not ranked in importance. The first one is non-conforming roof changes. This item came from our permit review specialist, is regarding changing the height of a roof of a non-conforming structure. The current standards allow a change in roof pitch to not more than 6 feet. The issue is that the standard could be misleading to suggest that the 6-foot height increase could include a wall increase when the intent is to retain the top plate and only allow a change in roof pitch. The suggestion is to adjust the language to clarify that only roof height, not wall height, may be raised 6 feet. So any concerns or comments about this item? I'm going to ask you this each time and then we'll move on. So you can kind of nod if you're okay or, okay, moving on. Item number 2. This is retail sales in the IP zone sub-area. This is a little technical without showing you the use table code, but it's for commercial mixed-use industrial special purpose use table lists retail sales in 3 separate rows tied to gross floor area. In the IP zone, retail is noted as a C for conditional use, with a footnote 5, which calls out a specific sub-area of the IP zone where there is an expanded list of uses. Footnote 5 states retail sales in the IP sub-area are permitted if equal to or less than 35,000 square feet. A possible code amendment would be to amend the use table to add a P in the IP zone column for retail sales, since it is permitted in sub-area of IP zone. This is just confusing in this table right now. We're just trying to clarify just by adding, instead of a C, it'll be a P. Any questions or concerns about this item? Okay, thank you. Item number 3, the current code states that certain architectural features, such as roof eaves, gutters, bay windows, may project 2 feet into a required yard or into a required open space as established by lot coverage standards. However, this is not consistent with the definition of lot coverage, which does not allow building features to project into open space. The reference to open space and lot coverage should be deleted. Any concerns or questions about this item? Okay. Number 4, So then in the Lake Road Village Center overlay, there's a requirement to have either a 5-foot wide landscaping area from a parking facility, from a driveway, sidewalk pathway, or a 10-foot wide buffer area from parking facility to the building. This doesn't say specifically that it has to be surface parking like my picture shows. It could potentially apply to parking within a building. This would just clarify that it only applies to surface parking, as has staff applied it over the years. Any questions or concerns about this item? Okay. Moved on, number 5. Residential building design standards. This one's pretty technical. Basically, we're just trying to have all the applicability sections in one section. So there's a table at the beginning of this that lists out the different zones. And then also it states in the building design standards which are applicable, which is kind of confusing if they look in both spaces to understand if it applies or not. This would add to that table at the beginning of the section to make it clear that this applies to high-density residential zones and add the R2 zone to that table. Any questions or concerns about this item? Okay. Number 6, access spacing requirements. So this table right here was already moved to Chapter 42 as a previous non-CDC amendment. This would delete it from Chapter 50 because it's redundant at this point. Any questions, concerns, or comments about this one? Nope. Okay. Number 7, this would remove private street from Chapter 50 because we no longer allow private streets. We don't have standards for them. That anytime it says private street, it should be replaced with street or access lane. Any questions or comments about this one? Okay. Item number 8, similar to item number 6 for access spacing requirements, Chapter 42 already covers the distance from a driveway. A driveway must be from an intersection with access spacing and site distance standards. On top of that, the TSP, Transportation System Plan, proximity guidelines range from 50 to 100 feet, depending on the level of street classification, local, collector, arterial. The current standard for this is on corner lots, the nearest edge of a driveway shall be a minimum of 30 feet from the intersection, which does not consider classification levels of streets. A possible code fix would be to reference Chapter 42 that talks about the TSP and classification systems. So you would have different levels. It wouldn't just be the strict 30 feet from the corner as is now. Any questions, concerns, or comments about this item?
So that would just bring it into consistency with the broader rule.
Right, with the engineering standards in Chapter 42. Okay, moving along to item number 9. So this clarifies when a minor development applies to single-family dwellings. In 3 overlays, the 3 overlays here, the DRD, LGVCO, and Westlake Grove overlay, include complex discretionary standards, or they have a clear objective route for housing. But neither of those can be processed as a ministerial review with, which is a staff decision with no public notice. This code amendment would clarify that single-family middle housing in those overlays must be reviewed with a minor development, which requires public notice, and it's usually not a staff decision, but yeah, it cannot be ministerial. The code isn't very clear right now. This would just say clearly that's only listed under minor development. Any questions about that? Okay. Number 10, this would correct an error in the ministerial list that just has an incorrect code reference. This one's probably the most straightforward one of all of them. No questions? All right, moving along. Number 11. So this would clarify in the code when the type 2 tree removal standards are applicable to minor and major development permits, but not tree protection standards. This came about from a Development Review Commission tree appeal finding that the current reference to tree cutting Chapter 55 is not specific enough to say it's only for tree removal. It could also be applied to tree protection. So this would clarify that instead of tree cutting chapter, it would say removal and reference Chapter 55.02 to make it clear that tree protection does not apply. Any questions, concerns, or comments about this one? Nope. Okay. Item number 12, sensitive lands correction. So our code allows corrections of the sensitive lands map. It's a little unclear when it should be a minor development or a major development. This would make it clear that if you're doing a map correction, that it is always a minor development. Any questions about that one? No? Okay, item number 13. Flag lot access buffer. This item would clarify that a house cannot cantilever into the required 5-foot landscaping strip required along an access lane for a flag lot. In looking at the context of legislative history, the purpose of the landscaping strip was to where trees could grow, and cantilevering a house into the strip would prevent that. There's also a question whether a 2-foot building eaves could be permitted to encroach in the landscaping strip as well, so we took a look at that. Any comments or questions about that? Okay. Item number 14, this item was raised by code enforcement staff. This item would revise enforcement and penalties to strengthen and clarify what constitutes a violation. Additional text is needed to state that violations are also civil violations as defined and enforceable by Chapter 34. Any questions about that? I have a couple of these enforcement items on here that code enforcement has been bringing to our attention, so not the only one to hear about that. All right, moving on to item 15, which is definition of flag lot. This would clarify that the entire building envelope must be located behind another lot to meet the definition of flag lot. This question arose if a lot could be considered a flag lot even though it had a frontage on a public street, which met the minimum lot requirement for the zone. It was determined that if a lot has a building site, an envelope, that is partially behind another lot and it takes access via an easement, then it is a flag lot. Otherwise, the definition is too subjective. This amendment would make it clear the entire building envelope must be located behind another lot to meet the definition. Yes?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So in this example I have up on the screen, this is a recent partition we had where this lot, it didn't meet the minimum frontage requirement, but it's not, and it's located partially behind 1860, the driveway, if you can see that there.
Okay, yeah.
But even though it doesn't meet the minimum width requirements for frontage, and it's located partially behind another lot, it is not considered a flag lot. The lots behind it, though, at 1950, 1930, those lots are located completely behind that lot, so those lots are considered flag lots. So we just try it, that's how staff has always interpreted it. This would just clarify the code.
Got it, okay.
Item number 16. So this is raised by one of our applicants that our native plant list lists snowberry and Douglas spirea as trees, which is incorrect because they are shrubs, and that should be moved to the shrub section of the plant list. So it's just correcting what's incorrect in the code. All right, so now we move on to policy amendments. These are the more juicy items that are going to require more discussion, but it doesn't have to be tonight, but just something to think about probably for the next work session. We're going to need to talk more in depth about these, but this will at least help you familiarize with what the items are. So the first one is code violation fees. The current code authorizes staff to enforce the code requirements, but does not explicitly state that fees can be assessed. This is something code enforcement staff has brought to our attention, and we want to make it clear that they can assess fees. So this one would just codify that the city's authorization to impose fees for code violations. Sorry, I needed the photo there, but. Any questions about this one?
So, I'm sorry, I'll come back. So it doesn't say that fees can be assessed, it doesn't expressly say that fees can be assessed, but we have been assessing fees in practice?
Right. That's
Has
true.
anyone challenged this to say, like, I guess, was it, what was the impetus for the code enforcement folks being like, hey, we need to expressly say this?
I mean, I don't know that anybody specifically challenged this one. The issue on these code enforcement fees, frankly, came up when we have adopted the code, we haven't adopted these enforcement fees. And then city attorney's office raised the question, well, we have that in the tree code section, but you're opposing it on other sections. So should we do so, we thought we needed to have specific code authority.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so number 2. For this item, this involves non-conforming historic landmark dwellings. So the current code requires that if a proposed addition or remodel to a non-conforming dwelling, any dwelling, including historic, if there's an increase in floor area by 50% or more, full compliance of the current zone dimensional standards and design standards is required, or the applicant may choose to demolish the structure. This is a contradiction to the purpose of the Historic Preservation Code. The case study here is before you, the elevation plan. This is 791 4th Street, the Brown Boss House. They recently were approved for an addition that increased the floor area by more than 50%. And the house is non-conforming to the side, front, and street side setbacks. They didn't want to change the historic house setbacks. They didn't want to do any additions to that. They just want to do additions to the rear, that did meet the setbacks. But unfortunately, the code would require them to either comply or remove the dwelling. What they had to do for this one was to get a RID variances to allow the existing footprint to be in the setbacks. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and like I said, it's contradictory to the point of historic preservation, to preserve historic houses. So this would have an exception in the non-conforming standards that historic landmarks don't have to comply with that standard.
I have a question on that one.
Okay.
I was trying to wrap my head around it when I was reading it earlier. I understand the historic landmark list and the motivation for preserving historic landmarks, but then I was like, if you're adding a whole 50% more floor area, aren't you not preserving the historic nature of the building itself?
Well, we have standards for any historic alterations. There's a minor and major. This was a major alteration, and there's many standards they have to meet to do that. And a lot of that is the addition compatible with the existing structure? Are they preserving the historic integrity of structure? Can the addition easily be removed or identifiable? There's a lot that goes into the review, and it is a public process. It's a minor development application. So that's already set up in the code for a major development like this, and it's already allowed. They could have done that if the existing house wasn't non-conforming. It wouldn't have been an issue. They could have just gone through the major development, major alteration process.
Mm-hmm.
So it's already part of the Historic Preservation Code.
And so this would make the process easier by making it an exception?
Essentially what it does is they still have to go through a historic review if you do an alteration like this, and they have to meet those standards. But what it doesn't do is apply the non-conforming section, which a lot of historic dwellings are non-conforming because they were built way before we had any code standards. And the problem with, we recently adopted those non-conforming standards, and we didn't think about historic dwellings. And it said, yeah, if you are going to do such a substantial addition, you need to bring the whole thing into compliance. Well, that totally is at odds with the purpose of the historic, which is to preserve historic dwellings. So this is, the only thing it's doing is exempting them from having to have the existing historic dwelling either fully comply or they have to move it, or they would have to demolish it and make the whole thing comply. They still have to comply with the historic alteration standards, which does require a minor development. It is a public process still. It just takes away their necessity for them to justify variances for the existing dwelling, which we are trying to preserve.
Okay. I guess in my mind, making a historic building 50% larger also arguably takes it away from the being historic, like preserving historically. You're adding 50% to a building.
That's a different standard.
Yeah.
And you know, this went through the full review. I mean, obviously, we're not here to review this particular application. This is an example, but yeah, it could be that a substantial addition may not comply and it might not be approved. But you know, obviously, we work with the applicant to help them steer them towards an approvable project.
So these historic preservation standards are like, we understand you want to do upgrades to a building, but we're going to do it in the best way to preserve the historical nature of
That's
the
right.
building. And so it's like a whole separate, okay, got it. Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Item number 3. So this is reconstruction of non-conforming commercial, industrial, multifamily, non-conforming structures. So previous code amendment in 2014 unintentionally made the limitation on reconstruction of 50% valuation of the existing non-conforming commercial, industrial, multifamily structures only apply in the case of natural disasters, not removal or demolition of portions of structures for reconstruction. Currently, regular non-structural maintenance on these structures is permitted, or the structure can be brought into compliance, kind of as we were just talking about the historic, with today's code. So unless it's the 50% is caused by natural disasters right now, you can either maintain it or you have to bring it back, you have to bring it into code. Staff feels this is overly restrictive and not the intent of the original non-conforming code amendment. So this would fix that item. It would just say something along the lines of, or by destroyed by any means, and that would allow owners of these buildings to upgrade the buildings, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be for maintenance items. Any questions or comments or concerns about this one?
I think, would it be, I think I see the intent here, but the language destroyed by any means.
That's just one option. Like, we're not talking about like code amendment, the actual language tonight, but
I see.
this is just to basically to allow you to wrap your minds around this and have any questions, or if you want us to do any more research. But we're not, that's just one example of what it could happen with the code amendment, but we're not proposing that tonight.
Well, would it be incorrect to think that language like that would, include a scenario where, like the owner decides to, destroy it by his own means?
Yeah, I mean, it could be
Without
for
any-
just for a remodel. So they could remodel these buildings, and it could be up to 50% of the value of the building. And that is allowed. It was allowed before the code amendments incorrectly took it away, basically, is what happened.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. Any other comments or concerns or questions? Okay. Item number 4, this regards cottage clusters, and middle housing land divisions. For those of you who don't know, a middle housing land division allows the creation of new lots with a legal parent lot solely for the purpose of expanding ownership opportunities with middle housing units, including cottage clusters. New lots created through middle housing land division process cannot be granted additional non-middle housing development rights. It must be maintained to meet standards applicable to the parent lot and are limited to one middle housing dwelling unit per resulting lot or parcel. So that's the basics of what a middle housing land division is. It's different than partitions and subdivisions, which create development lots. This allows, you start with one parent lot, and then you're allowed to create these middle housing lots that are similar to condo lots. So the question for this one is, when a middle housing land division is proposed, in this case it's courtyards, it's cottage clusters, should the courtyard or parking be within a separate tract, or should it be within an easement over the lots? This was brought forward by one of our neighborhoods, and they were concerned that owners of each cottage may treat the courtyard, the required courtyard in the middle, as their own lot, to use as their own, to like fences to other structures in the private courtyard, if it's not within a tract. So a tract is that's on the plat right there. It's just part of the land division. It's not something you see on the ground. It's part of a map. And it's an HOA. The tract is owned by the HOA and managed by the HOA. So that's one option. This is a cottage cluster middle housing land division that was done in the Howland neighborhood. The other option would be to simply not require a tract and just have an easement that where the parking and courtyard could be placed. So this is the item that we'll be considering. Any comments, questions, concerns?
Yeah, I was looking at the pros and cons here, and materials and on the cons, more research needed. It's unclear if requiring the courtyard to be in a tract would add more red tape for applicants or have any other negative impact. I mean, I guess that was actually my exact question, sort of like, we're already dividing this up, like how much more work or for both a developer, but also for staff to just like add one more, like divide one more up to be a separate track. I couldn't sort of understand like how it would actually be a lot more red tape to do it that way.
I can kind of briefly describe it to you. I mean, this might be better for the next work session, but so if they didn't do a middle housing land division and it did a cause cluster and it was all one lot and it was just an easement, that's just recording something on the deed that there's an easement over the courtyard or parking, there's a common maintenance agreements, things like that. Fairly easy to do. You just go to the recorder's office and you can record it. This requires, middle housing land divisions requires you go through a land division process. And then you have to record a plat at the county. And the whole process is much longer and costs more money. And the advantages of having a tract, maybe we know from DLCD that they don't have a strong opinion either way. One's fairly straightforward, and one, maybe there's advantages to the developers I don't know about, but the cost and process to do a middle housing land division with a tract like this is vastly different than doing just an easement.
Okay, I think I missed that this apply. I thought we were only talking in the context of when a middle housing land division was being done. So if they're already like going that costly route to create 6 tracks, is it really that much more burdensome to create 7, and that 7th being the courtyard or the parking? That's what I didn't quite understand.
I'm going to jump in a non-cost factor.
Okay.
Because I think that's really what drives this. If property's in a tract, nobody thinks they own it. They do have an undivided common interest in that tract pursuant to the deed. Their deed says they own this lot plus an undivided interest and right of use in the tract. If you have a lot that happens to have the full courtyard in it, subject to an easement of everybody's right to use it, okay? People think they own it. My lot goes all the way up, you know? And our experience has shown that when people see property boundaries, that to them is more compelling than, oh, that part is subject to an easement of rights of others to use that part. I mean, we find that in sensitive lands tracts, in open space tracts. This is a form of an open space tract. So it avoids the conflict between the property owner who has the courtyard on it versus the others. Also, there's a perception by a property owner that happens to have the open space tract on it, goes all the way around. They think they are being assessed for the full property per square foot. Why am I being charged for that when I can't use that part as my own? Now, the assessor is not supposed to give a same square foot value, okay, for the part that is subject to the easement, but it's hard to explain to the property owner to do that. And frankly, the assessor probably never even gets into it because of the separation between fair market value and assessed value under the current processes. So the assessor really doesn't care because the assessed value never tracks with a fair market value. But the owner thinks, I'm being charged for the full value of my lot. So that's the non-cost basis in how you process these applications. Why staff believes that a tract for common area is a better tool and it's a better tool for property owners so they don't think they own what they don't own.
Sure.
Okay.
And I mean, I agree. My line of questioning was, I didn't understand the con. I totally agree. I didn't really understand the con.
I mean, there would be some surveying involved, but I think really the surveying costs are the same, whether you have to describe it by easement or whether by a tract on it.
Can I just bring up the issue of the sort of entity that controls the tract? So if you create a tract, I believe you also have to develop an entity such as a homeowners association that would sort of control that tract, or it could be some other entity,
No,
but right? I mean,
Well, we've debated on this. Okay.
Clearly.
and that could be a barrier. I guess that's what I'm trying to, that's my point.
Commonly, when you have common property that is supposed to be maintained in common, property owners will, like a small subdivision of partitions, will create a homeowners association. All right. They're not required to do so. In fact, I live in a townhouse that has seven townhouses. We have some common property, but under the terms of our deed, we have a common undivided interest in that common property. If the common property is a tract, you can say everybody has an undivided interest in it. Now, how do you actually manage that? Okay, you can create a homeowner association. That's great. You've got bylaws, you've got procedures, you've got meetings, and that sort of stuff. All right, okay, great. If you don't have that, you have an association, an unincorporated association. You have common owners that need to commonly get together and decide how to do things. No structure, type of thing. But you could certainly have I own lot 5 and an undivided interest in tract A, okay, with the rights to do so and an obligation, a common obligation to maintain that. Okay? And how's that decision made? A majority of it. You can set it up in the CC&Rs without an HOA. Commonly, you do an HOA, so somebody's going to call a meeting. It's a little more better.
Okay.
But it's
But
not
we
just
have disagreed.
access, it's a separate tract of land that needs to be managed, I guess is my
It
point.
is a
It's not just
separate
an
tract.
easement.
But it would have to be managed even if it were like on one person's and everyone had easements. I actually think that'd probably be more complicated to manage when it's done that way. So I didn't mean to derail that because we got a lot to get through for just this one point, but really when I look at, I'm saying don't do more research on the cons. That seems like the way to go, but that's my opinion. Or maybe I'm too early for giving that opinion because we still have a lot more work to do on this, so.
Well, I would just add that this actually came up in the annual amendments last year. If you recall, it was, we were kind of I don't know if we were at the hearing, but we were kind of late in through the process, and this was brought up by the neighborhood association. And the way that they framed it was, we should require a tract and an HOA. And I do think that is more arduous to require that. And at the time, we were reluctant to add that in without understanding what the full consequences might be. And so we said, we will put this on the next round of amendments, which is what we're doing. So I think what we'll do is we'll look at how other cities have handled this, and we just want to make sure that we aren't missing any issues that may make these types of developments more difficult, because that's certainly not what our intention is. Right now, our code allows either, so it's the developer's choice. Either way, we can impose conditions of approval, even if it's not a separate tract that requires, that it doesn't allow encroachments, other things, and it's all enforceable under current code. So we don't really have a problem right now, but if it is more advantageous for us to do the tract option, which staff is, at least preliminarily, we think that's the case, then we may want to incorporate it in the code, as long as we're not also creating bigger issues or making it harder to develop cottage clusters. That's what we just want to avoid.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, item number 5. This one's pretty meaty. Home occupation. So this is an item that has been a challenge for our code enforcement staff. So there's a couple of criteria in here that are pretty subjective. The first one I listed out here, the use does not alter the residential character of the neighborhood, nor infringe upon the right of residents in the vicinity to the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. This can be challenging for the code enforcement staff to enforce, and because code enforcement is a complaint-based system, this requires basically neighbors to tell on their other neighbors and monitor their activities for home occupation, and this can cause conflicts. So staff is recommending that we try to create clear and objective standards for home occupations. And this will require additional research. I've already started looking into other cities and how they handle it. But that's the basic issue of this one. Yes.
Do you have any examples of what you might add in here?
Well, it might be, not this time, and we don't have draft code language available yet. This is just a discussion at this point, but, I mean, it would probably be to remove criterion 1, or to have some parameters about what uses could be allowed that would preserve neighborhood character. And looking at other cities, honestly, a lot of them don't have this standard. It is really subjective, and it's hard to enforce.
Yeah, I imagine the list could get quite long.
It is, and, you know, it's going to be difficult, but I think pretty much anything is better than what's there now. I mean, alter the residential character. I mean, that is just that's up to whoever your neighbor happens to be. And that's not fair,
Yeah.
right? So one of the things that we could look at is maybe we don't allow outdoor activities. So people can't have outdoor classes that might cause noise into the neighborhood. We could look at, you know, requiring that all parking be on site. Hopefully that's not, that doesn't run afoul of anything now that I'm thinking about what we're doing with CFEC. We could limit the number of trips. I mean, there's different things that we could do, and that's something that we need to study and look more into. But just having something that is measurable and clear and objective so that we don't have people, you know, claiming that small things are totally changing the residential character and having to argue with folks about that. That's
Yeah,
what
this
we're
would be a
trying to
great one to get some community feedback
Yeah.
on.
It seems to me like the majority of the problems would come from home-based businesses. And it seems like that is the root of why it's so difficult, is because there's, for every type of home-based business, there's a potential problem. But then there's also just, you know, working on your laptop from home. I did that today. I didn't cause any disturbance. So
And that's not a home occupation. If you work for if you're employed by another company that's, you know, say in Portland or whatever, and you're working from home, that's not a home occupation. Home occupation is where your business is based in your home. And we have other standards. I mean, this is just one of the criteria. There are other standards that are very clear and objective, like we have one that limits this, the percentage of the dwelling that could be used towards the home occupation. So I think it's something like 25% of the dwelling, no more than 25% can be, so you can't have your whole house be the business. Another one is that you can't have any outside employees other than families who reside at the residence. We don't want people with 10 employees showing up and parking all over the neighborhood and, you know, coming and going, you know, and whatnot. So those are some examples, and there's, what's that?
Sorry, no signage. They can't create a lot of dust or smoke or anything like that.
Right, well, we do allow signs, but they're limited. They're much smaller in the residential neighborhoods, but you can have a small sign. In terms of dust, smoke, we don't have anything on that, but we do not allow any outside storage of goods. So if you had a landscape business, you couldn't like store all your plants out or whatnot. Because again, these are types of things that do infringe on the residential character of the neighborhood. But I think what this gets at is more to the noise impacts, the potentially parking and traffic, and those are the types of things we get complaints about. Like if someone has a business where they're seeing 20 clients a day, that can have an impact on the business. But we have a lot of people who, you know, maybe have 2 or 3, but their neighbors still might complain. But we want to set some parameters that it's like, it's okay to have a certain amount, but not over a specified amount.
So you do mean clear and objective standards, not
Yes, no.
not clear and objection standards.
Oh, yes, objective. Sorry for the typo.
What is the context for where these standards are applied? Is this like a bit licensing, they're in licensing, or in like a land use change, or is just understanding where we apply these standards?
Well, so this is in chapter 50, but, so it's home businesses that require business license, and they're run out of their home. Is that what your question is?
Is it?
When do we review?
Yeah, when do we review, like, is it the Development Review Commission's reviewing this application?
I see.
Like,
So there's a building, so the business license is the first step of review, and they submit a business license application that has a description of the use, and we look for potential impacts then. But for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the code enforcement that receives complaints from their neighbors saying this business is causing impacts and altering the residential character of the neighborhood, for example.
To answer it specifically, home occupation is outright permitted use in any of the residential zones, and therefore, planning staff, which reviews the business license application and signs off on them, then reviews it ministerially. And so you have a ministerial review of discretionary standards.
Got it.
Trouble.
The basis of my question was, is there a public hearing where the neighbors can all come and say, we don't want this business here? But the answer is no
there's
to that. Got it.
Not
can't
unless
take
it's
it to this-
appealed, because if we deny a business license or we put a condition on a business license, the applicant has the opportunity to appeal that, in which case, I think it goes to city council.
It goes to city council.
Interesting. Okay.
Mr. Boone, could some of the unwanted, activities that are laid out here be subject to like a nuisance claim?
Well, let me break that into two parts. There's a public nuisance and a private nuisance, okay? Once we have concluded that if we conclude that it meets this criteria, it does not alter the residential character, I think it's pretty hard to make it a public nuisance. Public nuisance, it's not declared to be a public, I mean, if you comply with the zoning, you should not be a public nuisance. The mere fact that we have concluded that it meets a land use standard doesn't foreclose the opportunity for a private civil dispute between property owners to say that their outright permitted uses is nevertheless a private nuisance. So a property owner still has their private property rights to claim that another use is a private nuisance. A classic example of that is a residential next to a commercial area, like, say, a dry cleaning business. All right. Yes, the city has said that's a great idea, but the fumes, et cetera, how it's run, that may create a private nuisance. There are, of course, criteria in the common law about what a private nuisance is, and that's not for us. Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. Item number 6, this is about accessory structures. So our current code allows a reduction to the side and rear setback for an accessory structure meets certain criteria. This is for if the structure is 40 feet from a public street, is separated from other buildings by at least 3 feet, and is not over, maximum height is 10 feet, 600 square foot building footprint. This is confusing for people, and it's a code enforcement issue as well, because the building code does not require a building permit for accessory structures if the building is 200 square feet or more. It does require if it's 200 square feet or more, or over 15 feet in height. So it's different metrics. So one requires maximum height of 10 feet, and then the building permit is 15 feet, and the reduction is 600 square foot footprint, but for the building permit, it's 200 square feet or more, and people are getting them confused, basically. And we don't know exactly why the maximum height is 10 feet and the 600 square foot building footprint. We don't know exactly where that came from. So this would just be to clarify and align the two so that it's to avoid future code compliance issues. Hope I explained that okay. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Okay. Number 7, sensitive lands mitigation. It was brought to our attention that minimum tree planting for mitigation does not take into existence existing trees. So if there's not enough room to plant the trees that are required, or presence of wetlands, which wetlands can require different kinds of trees or maybe not trees at all. It simply is just it's a clear and objective standard where it's based on density. So the standard is native trees and shrubs are required to be planted at a rate of 5 trees and 25 shrubs per 500 square feet of disturbance area. So if you're going into sensitive lands and you're disturbing an area, say you're grading it for something, then you have to mitigate that somewhere else in the sensitive lands, and it's just a basic number requirement, but doesn't take into account the on-ground situation, basically. So this would try to create standards that are more, I guess, more subjective to the situation involved. These are clear, well, these are subjective standards. That's kind of the item on this one. Any questions, comments,
So this almost becomes like a case-by-case basis?
It would allow more flexibility on the ground situation on the site instead of just a basic number requirement.
Right.
And I guess I should note that, yeah, we've had some parks projects, like our Mountain Park is a good example, where they were required to plant way too many trees than was physically possible to plant on site. It was in the hundreds, and they just didn't have the room to do it. And the code does allow you to plant somewhere else in the watershed area, but it's just, this needs to be looked at and adjusted. Okay, on to number 8. So these are commercial design standards. Staff has been applying the commercial design standards to accessory structures such as freestanding canopies, picnic shelters, or similar accessory structures. This elevation plan before you is the bus barn. On the left is a fueling station canopy. As part of the bus barn approval, we had to evaluate the building standards for the fueling station canopy. We would like to adjust this to clarify that accessory structures, the building standards do apply, or if they don't, then we should talk about why not. And maybe they should be evaluated in a different section that talks about in the building design standards that it says design bus shelters, drinking fountains, benches, mailboxes to be complementary in appearance to buildings instead of the broad building design standards for commercial. It's just something we'll look at, but this needs to be clarified in the code is basically the issue. Any questions, concerns, comments? Oh,
I have a comment.
sure.
For a lot of the smaller accessory structures, some of those are sort of like prefab and off the shelf, so requiring them to match the exact style of the building is sometimes adding quite a bit of cost to get something custom.
That's a good comment. Thank you. That's true. Anybody else? Okay, moving along. We're moving through this. We're getting there. Item number 9, middle housing land division classification. I think I mentioned when we were talking about it earlier that middle housing land divisions are classified the same as partitions and subdivisions. This is problematic for us to apply when we reviewed middle housing land divisions because it's just you're dealing with the parent lot and they're creating these sublots that aren't developable. But the problem with classifying the same as partitions and subdivision is it triggers the same standards as partitions and subdivisions, such as access requirements, open space, landscaping, all these things when they're actually redeveloping the property. The property has already been developed. So this would create a separate classification that would not trigger all those standards. And it would be just under minor development. It would just have a different classification of middle housing land division instead of partitions and subdivisions. Hope that's clear. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Number 10. So for a while there, we were having many pre-apps about generators. And the reason why pre-apps were required because they wanted to put generators in yard setbacks. And the current code does not allow minor variances for generators specifically. You can reduce it to 20%, but that people want to place them. Some of these generators are pretty big, like the picture here. And this was in the front yard. It's about 5 feet from the street. But it's screened and maybe would have been acceptable, but the current code requires a major variance. Major variance, the criteria are pretty strenuous. You have to show a physical hardship with the property or taking with the property. There has to be something that is hard for a generator to meet. This item would consider adding generators to minor variances. It could be to exceed the 20% reduction threshold. Any questions, comments?
Let me just add one. I'm sorry. It's every time I tell I think this raises the question, or the reason why this becomes the issue, is a hardship variance first requires an unnecessary hardship. Is the inability to have a generator an unnecessary hardship? They're not so prevalent that they are throughout the city and considered like a two-car garage, where that would be an unnecessary hardship not to have a two-car garage. So that's what staff was struggling with, is we would have to look at them as an unnecessary hardship, which is darn hard to meet. Because is it a necessary hardship if you don't have a generator? You have to get over that threshold. So based upon the impacts, that's why staff is recommending it. But that's the challenge that unnecessary hardship creates, is we have changing times, okay? And what is unnecessary 20 years ago is perhaps more necessary, but maybe not ubiquitous, like two-car garages, in today's world. So.
And we actually had this come up several times. This wasn't just a one-off. We had like a cluster of them for a little while where, and this thing is big. This is like the size of a refrigerator, but again, sunken into the front setback, totally screened, like neighbors cannot even see it. And we had another situation that was very similar, where it was very well screened, but didn't meet the technical front yard setback. And in our minds, it's like, well, they still have to go through a process to get the variance. The minor variance seems like a more appropriate process for this, because we can still require screening and make sure that there aren't any visual impacts or other impacts to properties or improvements within 300 feet. But to go through the major variance process, as Mr. Boone pointed out, is just too rigorous. It seems a bit much for these. And certainly we want to encourage folks to have generators, because we're seeing more power outages and extreme weather and that type of thing. So this is something that we're seeing a lot more households want to put on their lots. And it becomes pretty challenging to find a spot to retrofit it later.
Is there any consideration for all of this with respect to the noise generated from these things?
Well, the other thing you have to remember with generators is these are not running all the time, right? These are running during power outages or
outage,
emergency
right.
events. So I would consider it to be temporary. I mean, obviously, we don't want, I mean, we can consider that, but to the extent that it really is a big problem, I mean, it's not an AC where it's running all
Yeah,
summer.
that's a fair point, yeah.
Well, and the criteria looks at impact.
Right.
And just on that note, I will note that many generators need to cycle every day or multiple times a day in order to stay in operating condition, so that can create noise.
The difference between a hardship and a minor variance says, I want to do this, does it bother anybody? I mean, I'm just summarize it down there. What's the impact upon the neighbors? A hardship variance says, I need to do this, or I will suffer an unnecessary hardship almost to a regulatory taking of my property. So because it's almost to that standard, regardless of the impact to the neighbors, I should be able to do this. I mean, it is the thrusting upon the neighbors in order to preserve this person's property rights, as we've declared them. So when you ask about impacts to the neighbors, that's the proper inquiry for a minor variance. In a major variance, not so much. Yes, we do look at whether it's the minimum variance necessary in order to alleviate the hardship. But ultimately, the hardship has to be alleviated.
A clarification on that, is the hardship on the neighbors, or is it that the
On the property owner.
On the property owner?
Right.
Okay.
So, again, I'll take the ubiquitous one. We have this commission, or excuse me, the Development Review Commission applying the standards has found for the last 15 years that a one-car garage is a hardship because most people in Lake Oswego have two cars. So the question then is, how do we cite that second car garage in while doing is minimum variance necessary to burden the property owners, which might be how it's faced, how it's fenestrated, how vegetation, how exactly where it's sited, that sort of thing. And that's what we're talking about here. But you don't even get to that threshold because is a generator a necessary hardship? Not having two cars has been found to be. Okay.
I see. I would argue that not having a generator is a necessary hardship for some folks, especially folks who might have a medical issue or a disability where they
We do-
need their
Yeah,
medical
we
equipment
do have
to
an
work.
ADA type of variance.
Okay.
Which applies more of the design standards. But of course, the challenge with that is a particular person may have that, and then they're not the owner of the property in perpetuity. So, but the property is left with it.
And I guess I should note that of the pre-apps we had, no one submitted an actual land use application. And it requires it to go to Development Review Commission. So we were never able to test out to see if the Development Review Commission would consider it a necessary hardship. But it is kind of a burden to go through the cost of a major variance and the process, where a minor variance is cheaper and it does not require the DRC to make a decision. It's a staff decision initially. Okay, moving along. This is the last one. Done great. All right, so this one is a little tricky. So it's looking at the definition of detached. So definitions up here, detached is defined in our code as a horizontal separation of 3 feet or more between the subject structure and nearby structures. So staff has been using this definition since 2008, most often for accessory structures such as garages to determine if a structure is attached. So we use the definition of detached to get to attached. So if a structure is less than 3 feet from another structure, eave to eave, usually is how we measure it, how it works out, then it's considered attached, and it has to meet, an example of a garage next to a house. If it's less than 3 feet, then it's attached, and it's considered part of the primary dwelling, and it has to meet the same setbacks. And there's other code sections for lot coverage and maximum floor area that can be a benefit if it's detached versus attached. So last year, as part of the code amendments, they added, as part of the city council approval, they talked about the definitions of duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, which added in there that here's an example of 2 duplexes that are proposed where they're attached by a common wall. And the definition was added to assure the units are physically attached by a structural wall at least 25% the length of the side of each dwelling unit. And the city council found the definition of detached was a little confusing and discussed whether the definition of detached should further be refined and if the definitions of the duplex, triplex, and quadplexes should be more descriptive. Looking at one example was the city of Bend that has location requirements of where it should be attached, not just a blank 25% at any point they want. So that's kind of the crux of this issue. We're looking at the definition of detached and if the definitions of duplex, triplex, and quadplexes should have some kind of other standard involved that has a location component to it. And this will require some more research to look at those other cities and see how they define this and how their cities treat this. Any comments, questions, concerns?
I was trying to think, when I was reading through it, and I think I remember last year when we did them, and we talked about attached, and we came like that 25% number, but that's attached. I didn't remember, like, what was the context of the word detached and its importance in this?
Because it's kind of the reverse, right? So we get to attached by the definition of detached before it was added to the duplex, triplex, and quadplex. So it was always just, if they were closer than 3 feet, then they were attached before. It didn't require the 25%.
Yeah, the big issue that came to the commission and then to the council, the last annual amendments, was that we found, like, somebody wanted to do a quadplex where they were physically detached by 2 feet. And per our code, because our code says, well, detached means separated from eave to eave by 3 feet or more, because they had less than that, it was considered attached. But we had looked in the council record for the middle housing amendments that were done a few years back, and the direction seemed to be that they wanted the quadplexes and triplexes and duplexes to be physically attached. So since we had that provision in our code and it applied, even if that wasn't their intent, we brought it back to council and say, hey, did you just want to confirm you mean this? Because we found this issue in the code. We didn't look at the definition of detached at the time and didn't realize that, it was kind of something that we missed. So just confirming that that's what you want. And the council said, absolutely, duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, we want them to be physically attached. So then we changed the definition of duplex, quadplex, and triplex to require that it be physically attached by 25% or less. And during that discussion, they then started bringing up the definition of detached too, and they said, well, why do we have that? And as Evan Franstead explained, it's because it originally came from accessory structures because you get reduced setbacks for accessory structures, and you can get some lot coverage exceptions for accessory structures. But we had people who were putting them right next to the primary dwelling, and the eaves are overlapping, and they almost look like a totally attached structure. So to deal with that, to address that issue, we created the definition of detached to require some separation in order to qualify. So it really was centered around detached structures, but it doesn't say that in the definition. So it applies to anything that is less than 3 feet measured from eave to eave.
Okay.
Maybe that's more background than you wanted.
Wasn't this part of a discussion, I remember, and I could be wrong, but we had a couple of builders in as guests talking about the cost savings of attaching structures opposed to detached, so you have to build basically a whole separate wall. And I think at the time we said, yeah, we get it, but we're going to ask you to be detached. Am I right on that, or?
Well, no, I mean, the old definition allowed them to physically detach or have it be detached by less than 3 feet, or they could physically attach it, and either way it was considered to be attached.
Okay, all right.
So it gave them more flexibility, but the council's feedback was, no, we want them to be physically attached because the whole point is that these should look like one structure that fits into the single-family dwelling. Even though there might be 3 units, they're supposed to be sized and similar to what a single-family dwelling would be.
I do think we heard some testimony from folks, either it might have been some commentary from the commission or folks in the public that said something about the sort of efficiencies of having a common wall. Of course, we had the proposal that did not have a common wall from a builder as well. So, I'm not sure what the cost calculus is there, but that's one of the first ones we received.
Okay, that was the last item. So the tentative schedule moving forward, this changed a little bit since the staff memo went out. Given that there's 27 items, and some of these are pretty labor intensive, I guess I would say, research, and it's gonna take us some time. Next work session is scheduled for January 13th, which would put the public hearing on March 10th and the findings on March 24th. And hopefully, if all that goes well, City Council hearing on April 15th. So I guess to summarize, we reviewed 27 proposed amendments. Thanks for your feedback and your thoughtful input. And I guess let us know moving along if you get home or tomorrow you think, oh, they should really research this or they should look at that. So you can always send me an email, and we'll see you on January 13th. Yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, schedule review.
All right, well, Evan just covered a big chunk of this. We had originally scheduled the next work session for the December 9th meeting date, so that's been pushed out now to January 13th. That's probably the biggest change that you'd see in this schedule that was sent out recently. So instead of the sort of work session on December 9th, we are planning to undertake a bit of a review of just like the year in review, a preview of what to expect for next year prior to undergoing the sort of council goal-driven work plan sessions that we'll have next year as well, earlier in the year. But just to kind of take stock of everything we've done so far this year, as well as kind of outlining, sort of regardless of council goals, that we've signed up for a lot of work to do next year, and just kind of putting that all in one place and kind of talking about that and, starting the discussion, I think, really. So, I think those work plan meetings early next year are really how are we going to help council reach their goals and what is our sort of planning commission work plan with respect to those. And this is a little bit bigger of a picture, acknowledging that those council goals are, usually, more focused on one or two things, and we're going to have to accomplish quite a bit next year. So anyway, just kind of taking stock of what we've been doing and what we've signed up for next year. And just starting the kind of conversation about what we could work on next year within that context of capacity and sort of workload. So yeah, I guess just in general, we, just as a reminder, we have canceled the meeting on November 25th. That's the Monday before Thanksgiving. So we aren't going to be holding a meeting that date. So that December 9th date will be our next meeting. And yeah, that'll be the last of this year. Of course, as Evan mentioned, the first of next year, we'll have another work session on the code amendments, the annual code amendments, as well as, there will be the Boards and Commissions Summit early next year as well. So on the, it's the 9th of January. You'll be getting more information about this, of course, but that's just something to keep on your radar that is expected of Boards and Commissions to attend that as well. So that summit will be a big event too. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Other things are a little bit more up in the air now, but there's a lot of work that we're scheduling for next year. So these boxes will be filling in quite a bit shortly. And that's about it.
Great, thank you. And so that is all we have for today. So this meeting is adjourned at 8:16.